My name is Jackson Ewing. I'm the Director of Energy and Climate Policy at the Duke Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second set of sessions for the day and to the panel, Scaling Energy for AI Demand, Risks, Opportunities, and Innovations for Low Carbon Solutions. Driving affordable, sustainable, and reliable outcomes in power systems is difficult in any circumstances. And as we heard this morning, our current circumstances are not typical. We are seeing massive load growth with some ambiguity about the characteristics and trajectory of it, but with no doubt that this is going to be a significant increase in the demands on our system as it currently is constituted, and really significant degrees of change that are likely to come both in the way that we generate, that we transmit, and distribute power. That is what we're going to discuss at our panel here today. We have an excellent group to do so. I'll begin just by introducing them, and I'm going to start with you, Allison. You're the president of 804 Advisory, partner at ASG, and a former commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner. To Allison's left, we have Rebecca Kujawa, who's the founder and CEO of Zerra Partners. She's a board member in Equinix and is the former president and CEO of NextEra Energy Resources. And at the end of the row there, we have Don Moul, the current sitting president and CEO of TVA. Let's dive right in. Rebecca, I want to start with you. Secretary Moniz made the point, or provocation, depending on how you look at it, that there's actually plenty of capital out there, that there is a dearth of shovel-ready investable projects. First of all, I'd love to hear if you agree with that sentiment, but also to just comment as someone who quite recently led one of the largest capital deployment platforms in U.S. energy. If you zoom out from these project-level economics and investments, what are the structural constraints in the U.S. power system that matter most for solving this AI-driven load growth? Are we talking about the generation mix, carbon constraints, transmission, permitting, market design, capital formation, something else? Where are those core challenges sitting today?
I think the answer to that is unequivocally yes. And I loved Toddy Steelman's introduction this morning, where she challenged us all to really come together, to collaborate, to communicate, because this is a system-wide challenge, and it's going to take all of the stakeholders involved actually to bring the solutions to bear. And so I was particularly excited to see the energy in the room as we're trying to wrangle everybody for this panel, because I think that's a sign that's actually occurring, which I think is a great testament to the convening power here at Duke. I'm thrilled, honestly, with the challenge of load growth, because I think it is what is going to be the catalyst that we need in order to solve the difficult challenges across energy. And I think this challenge, both from an economic security standpoint, energy security coming to the forefront, and then even the policy shifts, even though they feel challenging at times, I think they really are focusing for all of us on to what the challenges are that we need to focus on the most and bring the solutions to bear. With respect to Secretary Moniz's comment, I think in some respects there is plenty of capital available in traditional type projects, traditional forums for investment opportunities. I think where there is a lot of challenge are on the newer technologies. So in that answer of yes, we need all of the above, one of the things that we need are some of the newer technologies to help solve these challenging problems, and that's where I think the capital challenge lies the most. Whether that's nuclear energy, $8 billion that Secretary Moniz commented on fusion is a eye-popping comment, but it is a drop in the bucket relative to what's needed to bring those solutions to market. And that will be challenging. So I think that conversation needs to continue. But I think my colleagues here on the panel have great things to talk about in terms of the generation solution, transmission solutions, and regulatory solutions that need to come along with that.
Yeah, that's a great segue to you, Don. You are in position of having to make these sorts of capital decisions on a day-to-day basis. How do you prioritize different options for generation, for transmission, for distribution in the context of the load growth that you're seeing in your own service area at TVA?
Yeah, let me start with the load growth, just to give you a sense. Because we were talking beforehand a little bit, we like to call it the lost decade. 2009 to 2019 at TVA was flat or declining load growth, right? And certainly after the pandemic, it's changed significantly, and the whole world has changed with the amount of load growth we're seeing. Last year, we saw about 1% to 2% load growth, and we're forecasting 2% a year for the next 5 years. And so everybody likes to talk about data centers, but that's not the only thing. We have in-migration into our 7-state region. For those of you who are not familiar, Tennessee Valley Authority, it's the state of Tennessee. There are also 6 sections of 6 surrounding states: Virginia, North Carolina, Northern Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, that are part of our footprint. And so we're seeing in-migration to those areas. They're very desirable for folks to move into. There's a lot of growth. There's kind of a joke that the official bird of Nashville is the crane, because there's a lot of cranes in Nashville, and it's growing faster than anything you can imagine.
That used to be a joke about Shanghai. Now
Yeah, I think they're all moving, right? But so it's real, and we're seeing some traditional industrial load coming in there as well. So that's a good problem to have. Growth is a good problem to have, but it's still a problem you have to solve. We always go back to our statutory requirement. We have a statutory requirement in the TVA Act of least cost planning, right? And so we will evaluate the cost of each asset, look at regulations that are in place, and we'll do an assessment. It starts with an integrated resource plan. We're in the process of updating our integrated resource plan right now. I want to get it in front of our new board. And that gives the broad ranges of the different type of assets we need to build. And then we'll have a power supply plan that's more granular, that talks about specific locations. But part of it is making sure we keep all the assets we have on the ground as efficient and effective as possible, whether that's extending the life of our nuclear fleet, which is the 3rd largest, whether that's extending the life of our fossil fleet, while that's hydro life extension for our existing legacy hydro assets, getting more output, and expanding in power purchase agreements that we have out there. So we look at all of that, we optimize what we have, we build new assets, and least cost planning right now will tell you it's gas all day because of the timing and because of the cost. But eventually it won't be, and we try to maintain as diverse a generation portfolio to balance that risk, because we have to deliver, and we have to meet the load, and so those are the factors that go into our decision making.
Just a quick follow-up, and I know we discussed this a bit at dinner last night, Don, but on gas specifically, how do you view the risk that arise from fluctuating gas prices when you've built in that sort of infrastructure? How do you try to hedge against that risk, and where do other forms of generation fit into that?
Yeah, I've heard it said if you are a CEO and you want to lose your job, predict the future price of natural gas.
We don't want you to lose your job, but I am asking
I'll shy away from making bold predictions, but what I will tell you is a hedging program is very important, and we spend a lot of time doing that. We have a lot of storage to try to balance out some of those risks. There is volatility and commodity risk associated with gas generation. And so we factor that into our future price projections and our cost projections and our least cost planning analysis. Again, nobody's future projections are perfect, and in fact, as soon as you write them down, you're probably wrong. But it's as close as you can get to understanding that risk that you're exposed to. The other part is least cost planning doesn't always mean the lowest cost, because there are different factors, there are risk factors that you can start taking into account. Eventually, the balance of your portfolio may tell you the next answer may not be gas, it may be new nuclear, which we are a leader in and we're continuing to move forward in, it may be hydro, and we balance all of those things in a thoughtful way before we make those resource decisions.
Thanks. Don, you've called load growth a good problem. Rebecca, you said you're thrilled by the opportunities of load growth. I think you've done an excellent job of ticking the box of opportunities in the title of our panel here, and I think there's ample evidence to support that enthusiasm through the influx of capital, which we heard about this morning, which we've introduced here today. There are, of course, other risks beyond what we were just talking about on gas, Don. You know, we have risks of overbuilding infrastructure. We have risks of everyday ratepayers holding the bag for infrastructure that is built to supply the load growth from data centers. We have risks surrounding not being able to meet the load growth challenge in a way that's quick and efficient enough to compete internationally in the AI space. Allison, I want to hear from you about how you view some of those risks as a regulator, how you see the regulatory approaches that can balance the costs of new loads and the importance of not falling into any of those pitfalls.
So Jackson's going to make me be the downer, I guess.
Somebody had to.
Awesome. I will say, I was so happy to hear something just lit up in my heart when you said you are thrilled by the load growth challenge, because I've been feeling something and I didn't know what it was, and I too am thrilled.
Some of it's terror. There's a
Yeah, there's a terror.
between the two.
First cousin.
So, as Don just said, no matter what we predict about this load growth coming online, largely driven by data center demand right now, but driven by electrification and manufacturing as well, is that we're going to be wrong. And so I don't spend a lot of time caught up in, oh my gosh, 60 gigawatts by 2030. So I think of it kind of from the bottom up. How much new stuff can the grid absorb in the next 5 years and beyond? And so from a regulator's perspective, when you're thinking about trying to protect customers, I think of it in the near-term timeline, like 24 months, and then what happens after that. So how do we get stuff built, hooked up on the grid quickly? We've had data centers who've been able to take advantage of, as Rebecca mentioned when we were getting ready for this, the system being long on space, right? The transmission system had a lot of capacity available. And so data centers could come in, whether it be in Northern Virginia, whether it be outside of Las Vegas, and they could hook up to the grid and they could bring down costs for everybody because there's more customers, you have a set of system costs, and they get shared across everybody. So the denominator's going up and the price for everybody's going down. That's no longer the case. You know, we are in a continuing constraining situation, and there's this wild rush for power that doesn't align with the regulatory time frame. The regulatory time frame just to do anything takes a long time. So there's all these solutions that are coming through IRPs, they're coming through in the Mid-Atlantic region, a one-time market to attract new resources. None of these solutions are going to bear fruit in the next 24 months, but the speed to power crushing demand from customers is right now. So what do you do during that time? The good news is, from the bad news, is that we currently operate our system at 30 to 40% efficiency across the country. So I like to say I'm a carpool mom. You know, I drive three kids all year long to and from swim practice. Like 4 times a year, I have a 4th kid. I don't go out and buy a new car, I just use my middle seat. The grid is operated like they have to buy the car in the first place for the 4 times a year I have to use my middle seat. That's it. We can fight about why that happened or if it's, you know, if I'm exactly right about that, but we have so much latent opportunity in our existing system, and we have so much opportunity for those emerging technologies. I think the regulatory challenge is bigger than the money challenge even there, even for the emerging technologies, because utility incentives are not designed around spending less and saving and efficiency. And that's not their fault. It's simply a product of how utilities have been regulated historically. So to me, we have that if as a regulator, if I want to protect customers in the next 24 months, I want to see us use all of that hardware and software that exists today, that can be deployed on our system at modest cost to allow us to use the middle seat more often. So that's where I'd start, because the rest of it is hard and bigger and longer term and more expensive, and the regulators have to deal with that piece too. But in the meantime, while that's playing itself out, before we commit a whole bunch of money to things that may or may not be required in the future, we can do the easier, cheaper, quicker things first.
Thanks, Allison. You anticipate the question I was about to ask you, so let's stick on this for a moment. And I will say I'm going to steal that middle seat analogy and start using it as my own. That's perfect. So you rightly point out that we have underutilized capacity on the grid, but how, from a regulatory perspective, can we incent its use more effectively? What sort of tariff structures might be appropriate for that? What sort of requirements, regulatorily speaking, for flexible loads could try to drive those sorts of outcomes? What needs to happen to take advantage of the opportunity you've just mapped out?
And I think this is where the thrilling part comes in, because for a long time during this last decade, people were fighting about these technologies as relates to climate change and the energy transition. The happy coincidence is that those technologies are also just great for affordability, and they're fast, and they can make more room for stuff. So I find the opportunity, the regulation that is needed is if there was ever a chance for utilities, for regulators to require utilities to meet performance metrics instead of tying their payment to total CapEx spend, this is the chance to do that. Utilities are excited and terrified. They have a great opportunity here, and I think there is room to do big spend and also to incent good performance. I think where you were trying to lead me in your question is to flexibility. And we have a system that for 80 years was designed largely around centralized thermal generation that had a similar operating characteristics largely, and things kind of moved along just fine. There was no concept of hooking stuff up to the grid and then telling them to get off the grid in times of stress. But thanks to the good work of the Duke Nicholas Institute and others, we have learned how much potential there is when it comes to hey, I'm a data center customer, and you can speak to this for Equinix. If I'm a data center customer, I hook up, and then during those 5 days a year, during those middle seat days, I just go to my backup gen. Now we can talk about what makes up the portfolio of backup gen and what that means from an air pollution perspective, but this opportunity to change behaviors on a very limited amount of time across the year is a really exciting one for new regulation.
Absolutely. I want to hear both what Rebecca and Don think about this. Let's start with you, Rebecca. What are the real risks of overbuilding in generation, transmission, data center capacity itself? Who ultimately bears that risk, and how does that play into this discussion we're having about additional headroom that might exist in the system?
Yeah, I think if you go back to Don's comment from a couple of minutes ago about the lost generation, he was referencing TVA, but I think it's common to many of the jurisdictions across the US that from that 2000 to 2020 timeframe, load growth was not significant in most parts of the United States in particular. And what preceded that flattening out and declining in some areas was a significant amount of generation build. As there are many utilities across the United States, particularly of their senior teams that are leading these companies now, that remember that time frame. Where we had overcapacity, and someone needs to pay for that overcapacity. So that ends up being the burden of the ratepayers in those jurisdictions. And so there's always this tension, this challenge of spending just the right amount of money, least cost, to meet the obligation to serve in a reliable, resilient, ideally low carbon way over time. So I think that's a challenge that we have to face, is like, how do you figure out whether or not this demand is real? I think there's a couple of ways that stakeholders can protect themselves. First, as Allison was highlighting, and Don is certainly implementing at TVA, is for those large load customers, have them enter into agreements where they are bearing the cost of that incremental generation, those incremental transmission solutions that need to get built. Why does that make sense relative to how we've dealt with it in the past? A large load for most utilities in the past was 20 megawatts. Literally, if you'd go and spoken to a senior executive, they would say 20 megawatts is a large load. 100 megawatts is a really big deal. And if that 100 megawatts decides to shut down, the plant turns off, that was an enormous impact to the rest of the ratepayers in that utility's jurisdiction. Well, fast forward to where we are today. We are talking legitimately about a gigawatt, 2 gigawatt, 5 gigawatt loads. In many cases, that is doubling the entire size of the utility or that local jurisdiction. So you really need to think about who's bearing the risk and opportunity of that economic investment. Now, fortunately, many of the stakeholders that are most interested in building those large capacity-sized resources have an enormous potential loss of opportunity if they don't do it, if they don't bear that risk. So I think that's a shift for not just the regulators and the utilities and the other stakeholders across this whole ecosystem, but it's an opportunity to have a different conversation than what we had before. So I think it's happening. I think many of the stakeholders are having conversations they never would have thought they were going to have a couple of years ago. but there is a lot of work to be done to really figure out what does that mean.
Yeah. Don, I want you to weigh in on this intersection as well. You've recently had a hyperscaler approach you and had a back and forth on the curtailment requirements that you might put in place to allow them to get the speed to power that they're looking for. So I thought it's a really great illustration of the sort of intersections that we're talking about. So tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And speed to power is really the priority right now that we hear from a lot of these hyperscalers. And so finding ways to be creative, and some of that is behind the meter generation, right? And but more importantly is, are they willing to be curtailable on those middle seat days, to coin a phrase that is becoming very popular right now.
It's trending, I'm sure.
I'm sure
Somebody,
we're viral.
can somebody hashtag this for us,
Yeah.
please?
Yeah. But you know, when you have this conversation, it's because the speed, it's not just regulatory or permitting, but it's just the speed it takes to build anything. Supply chain, and if you're building out generation and transmission, it could be, hey, I can hook you up for that 150 megawatts of load in 4 years. That's never going to be a happy conversation at the end if that's the only part of it. The flip side is, or can you be curtailable? If I call you and here's the price signal that I give you, I'll give you a discount if you're willing to do this, but you have to be able to perform, right? And we found partners that are willing to do that. And there's been a couple of bumps in the road, but by and large, they've been able to do it. And so when you think about speed to market in the near term, being able to have a 150 megawatt load that goes from 150 megawatts to 20 in 20 minutes is a huge difference on a really cold winter day or a really hot summer day. And that allows us to maintain the reliability our customers expect. Now, there are new builds in process. I mean, we're in our largest capital expansion we've ever had, 6,200 megawatts in the planning phase. We got 3,700 megawatts under construction. And that doesn't even count the small modular reactors that we're moving forward with on construction permit applications. I was thrilled to hear Secretary Moniz talk about, that's a thrilling day for me, talk about fusion, because we're working together with Type 1 Fusion at our Bull Run facility. So some of these innovative ways to go forward without putting cost for us on our customers and maintaining affordability, tipping our toe in the water and having that next phase of build out in that 2030 time frame, where they come online and gives us greater diversity and gives us the ability to handle these loads. That's really important to us.
Can I chime in one provocation on that? Because I think it is capture our intellectual interest, as it should, the research from Nicholas Institute and Tyler Norris and the team around adding that flexibility to these large loads. But it is a little more complicated than just understanding that there's extra capacity. And part of that is the way the utilities and the system operators, the regional transmission systems, have operated in the past, which is they largely thought that load was dumb, it's not controllable, it just whatever shows up, I must serve and must be able to meet the need of that load. Again, kind of a passive way to think about it. To think about them to be dispatchable or curtailable, it can't actually work very well in practice if what is required today is a phone call to that load and tell them to curtail. Because one, it's time sensitive. These tend to happen in milliseconds, not many minutes. And two, they don't always comply. Which unfortunately is a track record across demand response more holistically in multiple markets, both small consumers as well as large consumers of electricity. So there is a system investment that needs to happen and a capability set that needs to be brought to bear that we don't really have in the markets today or available to the utilities in these markets.
That's a great point. I mean, we're getting ready to bring online a new system operations center, and it's going to be state of the art. And I won't go all nerdy on you and tell you about the Faraday cage or anything like that that's inside. But what we've also found is that flexibility, it's partnerships and communication that matter most. A winter storm is not going to sneak up on you very often. You usually have 24 to 48 hours ahead where something's coming and it's going to be significant. And what we found is when we facilitate those conversations early with our large load customers that are in our demand response program, they not only perform, they overperform. And you couldn't ask for a better partnership than that.
I want to stick on this, and Allison, in just a moment, I want to press you to get into some of the hard yards of the regulatory issues surrounding this. But to stay on the business side for just a moment, we at the Nicholas Institute and our reports on this don't see flexibility as some sort of panacea that's going to just magically happen because it is theoretically possible. That's both in terms of Tyler's paper last year on the existence of that headroom and on our more recent report on the different sorts of cost implications and energy mix results that could happen if we do implement certain degrees of flexibility. But as you say, the system isn't currently set up for that. So in terms of what we would need to alter that calculation, is it smarter software approaches like an Emerald AI? Is it better battery infrastructure like a Verus or a Voltage or what we're seeing from Iron Mountain? Is it some better communication combined with those infrastructure changes like you just referenced, Don? How do we get from off the page to implementation? Let's start with you, Rebecca.
I think it's, again, another one of those yes answers.
Yeah.
You need a couple of different layers of capability. One, you need the customers, like the ones Don has referenced, to be willing to do that. They need to implement certain technologies to make it more seamless, more controllable from a system operator perspective. You actually need the system operator. Most utilities don't operate in isolation by themselves. They're integrated into a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator through which and by which those rules they need to operate and comply. So the system operator needs to have policies and procedures for how they're going to implement it and the capabilities to actually employ it. And then you need to think about the cost allocation of this. What is the value of someone who is not going to consume as opposed to someone who is going to consume or is not as flexible? So I think it is an all of the above that you need to work through, and it is very different than the way that we have thought about it in the past. So it is another one of those. You got to bring all the stakeholders together, get consensus about how to operate it, and then we need to implement.
Thanks. Don?
Yeah, and I think the answer is yes as well. It's a little bit of everything, and I am never anyone who's going to bet against technology and development of longer duration storage or different technologies like that. I will tell you, I like a little bit of old school stuff too, and we are very blessed. Well, we're unique in that we are our own system operator, so we operate at the generation and transmission level, and we have our own balancing authority, and we're the reliability coordinator for our footprint as well. So that gives us an integrated approach. But I think what's even more important for us is the ability to look at some of the old technologies too. And we have a hydro system, and I have a 1,600 megawatt pump storage facility just south of Chattanooga that is incredible. And we're evaluating some other locations for that. So you want the longest duration storage, 24 to 30 hours worth at 1,600 megawatts that can swing 3,200 megawatts in 30 minutes is an incredible resource. So it's not easy to do, but nothing worthwhile really is. And I will tell you, my system operators love pump storage more than anything else.
Yeah, I believe that. We'll return to some of those energy mix issues in a second, but I do want to get into the weeds a little bit, if I may, Allison, on the fluid and dynamic regulatory space that we're in right now, both nationally and subnationally. Let's start with the national. We've seen some FERC DOE announcements in the recent months that could alter calculations about data center expansion and meeting load growth, bringing up jurisdictional considerations, implementation questions. What's the state of play right now? What do we need to be thinking about?
I think all of our heads are spinning on this a little bit because things are coming from all directions. I just want to add, though, theoretically on paper, even if we can flexibly load our way out of this challenge, that's not the whole story. Our system is outdated. Our transmission lines are old. Our generation is a majority old. And it's really important to remember that unlike building a new bridge, unlike building even a new highway that comes from the general fund, individual utility bill customers pay for all of these investments. And so it's hard to be systematic completely because costs and benefits don't fall down easily across one jurisdiction or one set of customers. And so there's lots, and we've lost a lot of hours of our lives thinking about how to improve transition system planning and development. When it comes to the stuff that's going on right now on the regulatory front, energy affordability is coming to a head for the reasons I just mentioned. We have a system that has needed a lot of investment in distribution and transmission. Commodity prices are volatile. You know, the extreme weather has increased. Wildfire risk is now a real thing around the country. So all of those factors played into the cost of electricity before data centers ever came on the scene, right? So we were at a moment where energy costs weren't going to go down anytime soon. And that, you know, you saw in the elections last fall, the salience of those issues, and they really are kind of mixing up the politics on a lot of these questions, because it's not straightforward that any one party cares less about people's, you know, utility bill concerns, even if we can fight about that in Washington all day. So this White House came out with DOE under Secretary Wright put out a letter to FERC and said, hey, FERC, as the federal grid regulators, you should issue this proposed rule that will standardize the way that large loads interconnect to the transmission system. Now that, we can get into the legality of it, but from my perspective, is actually straightforward, down the middle of the fairway, federally jurisdictional. It hasn't really had to be tested historically, because most of the large loads that were 20 megawatts were hooking up to the distribution system, which is state jurisdictional, not the transmission system, which is federally jurisdictional. So now all of a sudden you've got these things hooking up as end-use state jurisdictional customers, but they're hooking up to the transmission grid. And so there's a lot of state concern over who's in charge. But what I find pretty promising, actually, about what this proposed rule did was say, we're going to standardize the process. We're going to accelerate you if you are willing to curtail. And I think if you bring your own generation, I can't remember what's in what anymore. Or if you you self-supply your power, and that's going to help us avoid some of the harder things to do. And so there's. That is being litigated at FERC right now through paper comments. The commissioners at FERC have all expressed openness to this concept. States are very concerned. We'll see what happens on that front. You know, then you move over, and the White House and the PJM governors, the 13 governors of PJM, probably half of whom didn't know what PJM was 10 years ago, are standing up together and kind of trying to direct these ostensibly independent grid operators to do certain things. So there's relatively a lot of change happening fast. I very much appreciate the spirit with which it's happening, because we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to do something, and this is a step forward. So we'll see how it plays out. I mean, there's lots more at the national level, but that's what I'd say on that particular piece.
So you referenced the national context. You gave us an insight into what that means for states, and you mentioned PJM, but I want you to go a little bit deeper on RTOs and PJM specifically. In what ways is that complicating for this? In what ways does the existence of RTOs like PJM create opportunities? Where does it fit?
Any question about where your financing opportunity or your development opportunity and the rules that dictate by which whether or not you can finance through, around, above, or below it are region specific. So if you're in the Duke Carolinas, which is a vertically integrated utility region, you have one set of rules and you have one set of processes and ways that things happen. If you're in a restructured state like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, New Jersey, and you have a federally jurisdictional grid operator overlay like PJM, you have a different set of rules requirements. And so as someone who's always believed in competition to save costs for customers, I theoretically love the PJM structure because it's competition with more competition over top of it. The problem is this entity and the stakeholder processes involved with it have kind of fallen down under their own weight. And so it's really hard for the markets in PJM no longer actually send signals to generators to say, hey, the clearing price for committing to be available 3 years from now is high enough, I'm going to go build a new combined cycle gas plant. And instead, they're only going to build new gas plants if there's somebody signing a contract on the other end for that power for probably 10 to 15 years. And so the market has kind of stymied new generation development in PJM. Then underneath the market, you've got interconnection queues in PJM, which might be the worst in the country. We've been struggling around the country to try and take the almost 3 terawatts of generation, which is was 90% plus solar wind storage, and is probably more like now 85-15 to thermal, they've been waiting in lines around the country for 5 to 7 years. PJM just shut down the process for 2 years and said, you can't come in. And so even if the market was sending signals for new builds, they're in a line that is kind of endless. And then you can go over, these are all good people working hard, so I don't mean to kind of hammer in on them. There's just some structural problems here. You go over to the transmission planning process in the Mid-Atlantic region, which has the cities of Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., neighbors to New York, Secaucus, New Jersey is there. And the transmission planning process hasn't been particularly effective at the regional level. And so all of those factors are going into not only the price of electricity for regular consumers, but the ability of new big loads that bring economic development to get online in the region. And so when I talk to investors, I talk to them about this all the time, all day. They're like, just give me the answer. Like, when is the market rule going to be final? When are we going to know? And there's this expectation that that these processes should act in economically rational ways, and that's unfortunately just not always the case based on the wildly complex history.
Rebecca, can you weigh in on this? I see you nodding, and I'm particularly interested in your comments on interconnection, which Allison has just teed up. It's certainly at the center of many of the challenges that we've been talking about. From your time at NextEra and from your current role, what do you see as the core components of that challenge, and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, I think Allison nailed it, which is just focus on the interconnection queue length to give an indication of some of the challenge. So 5 to 7 years is not uncommon. It was actually ballooning even more than that in the Midwest for quite a number of years. And that creates a tremendous amount of challenge, not the least of which is, those of us that had, put projects in the queue, had designed and thought about what was needed 5 or 7 years ago. And as we heard from Christina Costa just a couple of minutes ago, think about what's changed just since middle of 2022. So if we had started the projects 5 years before that, clearly we weren't prepared for what happened in that 22 and continuing time frame. So what we were planning was not what we need now, and we still can't get what we need now through the process very quickly. I do think this is where some of the large load participants can really bring the resources and capability to bear to help solve the problem. Back to, again, Tati's challenge this morning is like, how do you remain optimistic? Well, again, some of us that's driving the challenge are the people most capable to bring the resources to solve the problem. I've seen several of the hyperscalers, so Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, engage with these regional operators to help them think better and more dynamically around the interconnection queue process, to help them think about how do they do these system studies, not just faster, but more dynamically with more variables, so you get a better outcome of cost allocation, and get that feedback back to the developers sooner. So several of the regional transmission operators have an ambition, they haven't quite achieved it yet, of going from the 6 to 7 years down to a year. But even that, in this day and age, may not be fast enough. So I think we need to keep challenging ourselves to figure out how to do this better. Imbue the resources and capabilities at these operator levels so they can make the decisions faster and better, enable the capital and the resources to build what we need.
What do you think, Don? How do we get that time span lower? I mean, do we look at a connect and manage type approach, such as we see at ERCOT, or do we stick with invest and connect, but take more efficient approaches to execuing it?
Well, I know the direction we've taken. We're unique,
yeah.
Right? Because we're not under FERC jurisdiction because we're a federal agency, but we follow generally FERC guidelines. So we've implemented the FERC Order 2023. We're doing cluster studies now where we used to do serial studies on our interconnection queues. So we're getting some operating experience going down that path. But I think one of the most important things is certainty for some of the developers, but also understanding there has to be some skin in the game.
Totally.
Because we have a fair number of those folks filling up those interconnection queues that are taking rent, right? And if the price of entry isn't significant enough, you won't have serious players there. And what that does to the analysis that needs to be done, because this isn't just like running an extension cord across your house and plugging it in, because if you have a bad day and you have a collapse on the grid because you didn't do your due diligence and the right level of transmission planning, we're the ones holding the bag, right? So it's making sure we have serious players in the queue. They're committed. And I get it. I mean, when the world changes on subsidies, for example, what was economically in the money for a developer all of a sudden isn't, right? And so we need to open those lines of communication and say, okay, now it's time to get out of the queue so that we can move through more rapidly.
And that skin in the game is something that's changed a lot and went in front of FERC, and several of the RTOs have changed what skin in the game means. And it's not just financial incentives, it is land control, it is permits, it is a plan for who is the ultimate customer. I think that's progress.
Yeah, it is.
It raises the stakes for everybody. It does limit competition in a form or fashion, but I think is beneficial. But many of the RTOs are already doing cluster studies, and it was the cluster study process along with a deluge of resources that wanted to connect that got bogged down when they couldn't do it dynamically and fast enough.
No, I agree.
Yeah. You're driving us towards where I want to conclude our conversation. Let's stick with you, Rebecca, in being very forward-looking on the durability of this load growth demand and the decisions that have to be made on the generation and transmission and distribution sides in meeting that demand. So if you were in a position to be investing tens of billions of dollars from the energy sector side, what sort of signals would you need to see from the new agents of load growth to give you confidence that you can make those sorts of investments?
Yeah, I think there's a time horizon difference in terms of what I would be looking for. In the very short term, I would be looking for commitments, whether this is sitting in the utility chair's perspective or as a developer serving load direct or serving those that demand directly or through a utility partner. I would look for skin in the game. I would look for a long-term contract that had commitments. Because honestly, those counterparties, whether it's Equinix, on which the board I sit, but I'm not speaking for them today, or any one of the hyperscalers, they know best whether or not they're going to show up. I think for building the pipeline portfolio of capabilities in anticipation of the demand, I'm looking for the kind of the signal and noise differentiators, and I think they're hard right now. You can certainly listen to all of the earnings calls of the major hyperscalers, going from $150 billion to $180 to $200 billion in a given year, and that's just one of them. I think is a sign of not just their ambition, but they're putting money to work today. So I think the intermediate time is really positive. But the further signal that I'm looking for is AI being taken up by commercial entities? It's clearly captured the interest of individuals. I use it constantly all day, every day, not just one model, but multiple models. It's clearly being used by the tech industry. We all are seeing the reports of Claude's codex capabilities and how code is being developed so much faster. But is it getting to mainstream industries? Are corporations getting profitable execution on these AI investments? As we see that ramp up, I'm going to have more confidence that that demand will continue to grow, not just the new frontier models, but also the longer-term sustainable growth. I think we're seeing the green shoots of that. I don't think we've seen the durable signs that it is unambiguously happening. I personally think it is, but I think we need to continue to see signs of that. Too many reports of major corporations saying, only 5% of them are getting a return on investment on AI. I think I've seen now one that's up to 20%. That strikes me as low.
It's certainly a place reasonable people can disagree, and I think we'll definitely see some evolution in the years to come. Allison, similar question for you being forward-looking. What regulatory signals are going to most affect cost of capital for generation and transmission to serve this AI demand?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much money lined up. There's so much ready to go, and that's the problem. Even when you make it harder to get on the system, there's so many well-financed, ready-to-go projects with customers. How do you deal with that scarcity issue? I guess what I'd say is, and it's not really regulatory, but it's somewhere between the regulatory and the financing, is that we have to have the dynamic modeling and the operations of the system that a modern U.S. economy deserves. If you think about, in some regions of the country, people are still manually switching transmission lines, like
That's
sending people out.
Yeah.
That's true.
And until we can run the system dynamically, the money is held up. And because you don't make a lot of money on that software piece, that there isn't this rush by utility, and because of the need to maintain a reliable system and the new nature of it, we have to unlock that somehow, and then the money can flow.
Thanks, Allison. Don, I had a final question for you, but as a good billions to trillions organizing committee citizen, I'm going to feel compelled to follow the rules and say that we have run out of time. So my apologies. Please join me in thanking our panel.